Okay, so I'm chairing this panel, and we will have myself, Bart Zielinski, raise your hand, Bart Zielinski, Frank Jacob, and Mark Gilbert are the panelists. So we look forward to a very interesting panel. So one of the things I didn't say at the outset is that one of the reasons I was interested in forming this conference or organizing the conference is because of the 100th anniversary of the start of the origins of World War I, because there's been all this great writing on it, and so that was one of the motivations. And in introducing myself, because I'm the chair and also the first panelist, what I'll say is my specialty is not World War I in Europe. My specialty is actually U.S.-Japanese relations, but this really intrigued me because what has happened since about 2011, 2012 is a number of really interesting, great books on World War I and on the origins of World War I. The scholars are actually doing this to commemorate the beginning of the war so they can sell more copies of their books. It's a great strategy. But you know, you have to like plan 5 years in advance to do this, right? You have to be really clever about this in terms of the market. So my paper is the first paper, and I'm going to do World War I in 21st century perspective, new scholarship on the causes of the war. And what we'll do is we'll have all the presentations, and then we'll do a time for Q&A. So if you have questions, please write your questions down or comments so that you don't forget them, and then we'll go into that at the end. Okay? All right, let me start. So what you see up on the slide is a picture of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and Duchess Sophie Chotek. And of course, this is the couple whose assassination sparked the beginning of World War I. So one of the interesting things about the beginnings of World War I is that the assassination took place in this vehicle. This is actually a 1911 German-made vehicle, and Sophie and her husband Franz were actually riding in that vehicle when they were shot to death. Okay, but there's a lot of interesting twists to this story. So one of the things about this vehicle is it doesn't have reverse gear. There's no reverse gear in it. Yeah. Why would that make a difference? Well, so Sophie and her husband were riding along in this vehicle, and they were in a kind of a parade in Sarajevo, and there was an incident. There was an attempted assassination, and so there were some people hurt. So they rushed them to this building, and they rushed the injured to the hospital. And the Archduke said, well, one of the other officials said, well, you should get on the train and go back to Austria right away. And the Archduke said, no, I don't want to do that, because I want to go visit the wounded. I won't be intimidated by this. So they get back in the car, and they're driving, and the driver takes a wrong turn. This broad promenade with all kinds of people standing around. He takes a wrong turn, so they have to get out of the car and push the car backwards because it doesn't have reverse gear. It just so happens that at that moment, Gavril Princip, who is the guy who assassinated him, he's standing right beside them when they stop the car. He shoots. This guy couldn't shoot straight to save his life, but he shoots straight in this case and kills both of them. And this becomes the spark that starts World War I. Essentially what happens is Austria gets very angry at Serbia because the Serbians, the Austrians don't have a lot of evidence, but it looks like the Serbians are sponsoring this act of terrorism through this shadowy organization called the Black Hand. And there's really not tremendously clear answers even today about it. But then the Austrians submit an ultimatum to the Serbians. The Serbians respond with, they're trying to resist it. They might agree to it, and the Russians say, no, don't agree to it, because the Russians want war against Austria. The French are involved, eventually the Germans get involved on the side of Austria, and then the British get involved, and boom, you have World War I. Now that's vastly oversimplified, and I'll show you why in a second. So the no reverse interpretation is really an interpretation of this war has no cause. Okay, this war actually doesn't have a cause. That's been a prominent interpretation in the past. It was an interpretation of John Keegan and some other major historians. But I think that this new generation of scholarship is actually moving beyond that. So let me talk a bit about the scholarship. Okay, so one of the things that's happened then is there's been this tremendous publication after about the origins of World War I. So we have, what I'm going to do is I'm going to cover 4 main books. The Sleepwalkers, Catastrophe 1914, and The War That Ended the Peace, and July Crisis. So, and these are major works that have gone into paperback and sold, lots of copies. So this is really a look at what's really in the popular consciousness. Okay, there are lots of other works that have been done in the last few years. Scholars trying to capitalize on the 100th anniversary of the war. But these, I think, are some of the most important works. Okay, now, in addition to these new works, this new scholarship, we have some old ideas that have really influenced the way that the causes of World War I have been interpreted, and who's to blame for the causes of World War I. Who is, in fact, to blame? So, this guy, Franz Fischer, he's actually a German historian, operated in the 1960s, writing in the 1960s. This book was published in 1961, in a second book published in 1967. This book was translated into English in 1967 for an American audience. So Franz Fischer was a kind of anti-nationalist, anti-German nationalist. He was writing in the 1960s when a lot of scholars tended to turn against tended to become very distrustful of nationalism. We talked about nationalism this morning. This new generation of scholars working in the 1960s really turned against nationalistic interpretations. And Fritz Fischer was one of those. And so it makes for a very interesting set of interpretations about the origins of World War I, and it's still very prominent today. That's the other part of this that I'm going to draw through my talk, is that Fischer's thesis, which you see right here, is something which is still with us today. Scholars are still debating this today. Okay, so before Fischer's thesis, what you have is German scholars interpreting in a very nationalistic vein that what happened at the outbreak of war in 1914 is the Germans became encircled by an alliance, the intent that threatened their survival, and the Germans didn't have any choice. They had to break out of this through warfare, essentially, in this case. Okay? That's a pretty prominent thesis in 1961 when Fritz Fischer writes his first book and begins to, essentially what he does, he begins to destroy this encirclement thesis. Now, Fischer publishes a book in 1961, and what he argues, his argument is actually fairly moderate. He argues that the German government, not just the Kaiser, had accepted the risk of general war in Europe. So it wasn't just a defensive posture of a response to encirclement. The Germans actually accepted the idea that their policies could result in a general war in Europe, and that was okay. So that was stepping outside of the encirclement thesis, and Fritz Fischer was attacked, pardon me, relentlessly because of this. Now he also argues that it wasn't just the Kaiser who was pushing Germany to war. In fact, the new literature, this recent scholarship, is really not arguing that at all. A lot of them show the Kaiser as being such a waffly guy who actually, he had liberal parents, and at some points he was actually quite interested in peace. and wanted to work out the differences between Germany and the rest of Europe. But so Fischer is arguing that it's actually more than just the Kaiser. There are others who are pushing Germany towards war, and that's certainly true based upon the newer scholarship as well. So I don't really have any disagreement with that. The last bit, and this is also quite true, is that it was generally acknowledged that the Russians were going to become more and more powerful. They were building their economy, they were building their army, and if Germany waited too long, then Germany might not be able to defeat Russia in a war. So there was some sense in which if you go to war in 1914, you'll win. If you go to war in 1918 against the Russians, you're going to lose, because they'll have too much time to build up their war infrastructure. Now, Fischer's scholarship really created some very fierce debates about the causes of the war, because he begins to put Germany at the center of the causes in a way that, and he's German, of course, the other powers, the Entente powers at the end of World War I forced Germany, Germany had to give up, but they actually put a war guilt clause into the Treaty of Versailles, which essentially blames the Germans for the war. So others were blaming the Germans, but not the Germans. As I said, German scholarship was this encirclement thesis. So Fischer goes further in 1967. This is where it really gets interesting. Fischer expands his argument to talk about World War I and World War II, and argues that what you have is this great continuity in German policy. It's not about a crazy Kaiser. It's actually about a deliberate policy of the Germans that was inherently expansionist from 1914 to 1945. That's a lot of territory, and that's a lot of blame to lay at the feet of the Germans. And this is what Fischer does in 1967. And for this, of course, he becomes hated by the right wing in Germany and loved by many Americans, actually, who are very interested in connecting Nazism to Germany's war aims in 1914. Because the Americans, of course, in 1967 think they understand Nazism, and to connect it back to 1914, it just ties things up very neatly into a narrative about German expansionism. Okay, so his arguments become very attractive among American left-wing historians. Now, there's some problems. There's a lot of problems with his argument. One of the biggest problems is that Fischer focused on Germany and on German motives. And he didn't actually say much about, French motives, Russian motives, Serbian motives, Austria-Hungary motives, British motives. He doesn't really say much about that. So this is a really big failing. The other thing is, he's focused on Germany. He doesn't talk about East Asia. He doesn't talk about Africa. There's nothing about the Ottoman Empire. There's all kinds of other features of the cause of World War I that he just doesn't discuss. So I'd like to say that we should leave this behind, but the truth is, at least a couple of the books have not left this behind. So let's move on to the new scholarship. Okay. Now, Christopher Clark, you can see a picture of him there. Clark is Australian. He's not British, but he does work in Great Britain. Clark his book has been the most embraced by the Germans because he rejects the Fischer thesis. He's not just laying the blame at the Germans. It's a comprehensive account of the failings of the French, the British, the Russians, not just the Germans, the Serbians, and the Austro-Hungarians themselves. So it's really much more broad-based, and it's a fantastic book. I'll be straight with you. I think this is the best interpretation of the new scholarship because it's broad-based and it's balanced in its argument. The book title is misleading. He does not argue in the book that people just kind of sleepwalked into the war, that the leadership really didn't think that they were going to war, and they weren't really cognizant of the consequences of their actions. He doesn't really argue that in the book. I think his editor probably gave him that title and said, you got to name it that, and that's probably where it ended. The other thing is he talks a lot about the Balkans, okay, and that's a really important part of this book. So he rejects the Fisher thesis. He's not going down that road. And he's also, he doesn't have as strong a British perspective as some of the other scholars we're going to look at. Now, talking about the Balkan Wars, or the Balkans in general, like Christopher Clark does, then one of the things that we tend to forget about is the changes between the Balkans in 1912, before the Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913, and then after. Because what happens is the Ottoman Empire virtually disappears in the Balkans. Okay? The only reason it doesn't go all the way to Istanbul is because the Russians step in and say to the Bulgarians, no, you can't actually go to Istanbul. And so what happens is the Ottoman Empire shrinks up, and it's replaced by Serbia, which expands, Greece expands up, Bulgaria expands, and so you have the development of a real situation here in the Balkans, and this is concerning to the Austro-Hungarians. They want a piece of this, quite frankly, and they're very nervous about Serbia, the growth of Serbian political and military power. The Serbians, for their part, there's a lot of different views in Serbia, but there is a segment of the Serbian population that believes that eventually all Serbians should come under one government. Because this whole area around Serbia is actually, there's Serbians living outside of the borders of Serbia. And there are those that argue for a greater Serbia. And this is actually the ideology of the Black Hand, which is the group that organized the assassination of Franz and Sophie. Okay, so that's Christopher Clark's book. The second book is Max Hastings' book called Catastrophe 1914. He does the causes and then the rest of 1914. So it's a comprehensive book on 1914. He's a really great popular historian. He's easy to read. This is a wonderful narrative history. He just really knows how to spin the narrative. But Hastings endorses the Fisher thesis. And just let me read you this quote, because I think this is it's kind of a smoking gun, okay? Hastings says, I'm among those who reject the notion that the conflict of 1914-1918 belonged to a different moral order than that of 1939-1945. Okay? If Britain had stood aside while the Central Powers prevailed on the continent, its interests would have been directly threatened by a Germany whose appetite for dominance would assuredly have been enlarged by victory. Okay? So he's making that connection to this continuous German policy of expansionism. Now, the other thing about Hastings' book is he takes a very strong British perspective. It's not that he supports everything that the British do coming up to World War I, but his base of reference is the British Empire and the British nation. And I think honestly, I think it's a limitation in his scholarship. But it's still a very good book. It's fun to read. Third book, The War That Ended the Peace by Margaret Macmillan. Macmillan, of course, is the author who wrote the book Paris 1919, which some of you might have read. This is a great book on the end of World War I and the Paris Peace Conference. It's just, it's one of the funnest books I've ever read, actually. It's really fun. And she's a great writer. In this case, she wrote another really good book that won a very prestigious prize, the Samuel Johnson Prize in England, which is considered kind of the highest prize for nonfiction in England. So she has the best, I think, international perspective on the war. She's the only author that talks about East Asia running up to World War I. Those of us who study East Asia are like, aha, somebody recognizes that East Asia is actually important. She also does the best job of using biography to argue for the flawed leadership of the major powers. And it's not just the Germans. The Tsar is almost as crazy as his cousin. And the British suffer from this kind of, the British have a liberal government, but they have conservatives behind that government pushing the liberals toward war, and the liberals are so uncomfortable, but these conservatives really hold the real power of the British government. The French government is led by Raymond Poincaré, who hates the Germans. He was born in Alsace, a province that was actually taken over by the Germans in the Franco-Prussian War. So he's got, does he have vengeance on his mind? He probably does have some vengeance on his mind. So she really maps the flawed leadership and the biographies extremely well, especially the Germans. And while she doesn't engage the Fisher thesis directly, I would argue that, and I think she's actually trying not to. I think she's deliberately trying to stay away from that because she doesn't want to be pinned down. She's a very clever historian. But I think when one looks at the structure of the book, she starts with the German invasion of Belgium. And that's what brings the British into the war, because the British have a treaty, a very old treaty with Belgium. It's a defense treaty. And the Germans know this. And so I think the structure blames Germany, even though Margaret Macmillan does not blame Germany. Okay, but she covers a tremendous amount of ground. She does a lot with the naval arms race. She probably places a little too much emphasis on the naval arms races between Germany and Great Britain for having caused the war. She also, once again, takes a very strong British perspective. Essentially what she's doing is in her book, she puts the British at the center of the narrative, and then she looks at how the other powers related to Great Britain, the Germans, the French, the Russians. And so it's an interesting approach, but it's a very strong British perspective. This should not be a surprise. Margaret Macmillan's is I believe the great-granddaughter of none other than Lloyd George, who was the guy who negotiated the Paris Peace Accords for the British. So, but it's a great book. I definitely recommend it. But I do think it's got this British perspective, which is, I'm not trying to pick on the British, I don't think. It's just that a lot of British historians have written on the start of World War I. It's really interesting. And I think it's a limitation. Okay, I guess what's happening? Oh, okay, there we go. We've got, I'll just close. Okay, so the last historian I want to talk about, and I'll be done in just a minute here. The last historian is a younger historian, T.J. Ott, or Oddie, and Oddie takes a different approach by just focusing on the July crisis of July 1914. This is after the assassination, and it's really when decision makers now have it in their hands. Okay, what are we going to do about this crisis? And he argues that actually better decision making could have made a huge difference, would have made a huge difference. In fact, he suggests that the war was completely avoidable with better decision making and better communication and better governance. So I think it's a very interesting analysis. He's not specifically blaming, he doesn't explicitly talk about the Fisher thesis, so he's not in that vein. He's probably what I would call just kind of a soft approach to the Fisher thesis, because I think he probably still sees the Germans as obtaining more of the blame than the other powers, but still the other powers definitely have blame. Let me just show up, if I can. I don't know. I don't think that actually worked. Oh, that's right, because that's why the Explorer just can't collapse, because it doesn't like that. Anyway, I was going to show you a little clip from T.J. Oddie in which he talks about how he argues that it's not just personalities, it's not just this biographical approach, weird cousins and monarchs that are just they're not good decision makers, and who knows, they might be a little bit nuts. he actually argues that the governance systems in place in Europe in this time period were inadequate to handle the extent of the crisis that they confronted in July 1914. That's kind of a paraphrase. Okay, so you'll have to live with that. But you can check this. It's a very nice video on the website, on the book publisher's website, on Cambridge University Press. It's published this book. So I'm going to end there, and I think my time is up. So, okay, thanks very much. Next we have Bart Zielinski. Bart?
Okay, well, without further ado, I will start straight away. I think I'll be talking about the outbreak of war and the diplomacy surrounding the South Pacific between August and essentially December 1914. From the perspective of, well, from a multi-archival perspective, even though mostly British for the moment being, but I mean, I've been to the French archives, the German archives, and to the US archives as well, so this is where this all comes from. Alright, I will start with a map of the region actually, from 1914, so let you have a look at this. There are German colonies there, there are British colonies there, French ones. Japan doesn't figure on the map other than on the very northwest corner there. The Bonin Islands and the Hawaiian Islands are there as well, of course. So, the Pacific Ocean from a World War I perspective could almost be considered a non-event, apart from some early naval and land battles climaxing in the destruction of the German East Asia Squadron near the Falkland Islands. However, the naval race for the German Pacific in 1914 suggests a much greater significance for the area, ultimately leading to a geopolitical reconfiguration with a strong Japanese imprint. In this paper, I will present the events in the South Pacific in late 1914 in order to finally argue that Britain had triggered certain diplomatic and military mechanisms in the area for the benefit of the defense of the British Isles, while leaving the security of the Pacific Ocean exposed to Japanese opportunism. The remaining powers, while engaged, lacked the will or leverage to exert greater influence in the events. So at the very start of the conflict, I mean, we have actually just heard about the start of the conflict, so I'm not going to go into detail. It was essentially, or originally, a European conflict, of course, but through the various colonies in the world. So in Africa, there was an African war, of course, and which is often overlooked, actually, there was a Pacific War in 1914. And for this conflict, Britain had prepared and planned, and so now I'm getting into, well, onto the archival level, quote, to deprive the enemy, that's the Committee of Imperial Defense, which was set up quite a few years before to decide on the greater strategy of global warfare within the British Empire. So the CRD had, although the CRD's plan before the war was, quote, to deprive the enemy of his distant bases and coaling stations, as well as of his wireless stations, unquote. According to this plan, the Dominions in Australia and New Zealand were to assist in the effort by seizing German New Guinea and Yap in the Carolines, which was the center of German communications in the Pacific at the time, and German Samoa, respectively. Just a few words, but maybe just a word about Yap. So Yap had the German cable coming in from actually in all directions. So towards New Guinea, towards it had a wireless as well. So the thinking was that if Yap was knocked out of the war and the other main bits, the Germans wouldn't be able to communicate anymore, which is actually what happened, but I'll get to that in a few minutes. The East Asia Squadron, which was based in Tsingtao, was to be destroyed or driven out of the Pacific. Furthermore, the Anglo-Japanese alliance from 1902 provided for Japanese support of Britain in case of crisis and had allowed Britain to withdraw its battleships from the area in 1905. However, Foreign Secretary Grey was at first reluctant to invoke the alliance, stating politely that Britain, quote, should avoid, if we could, drawing Japan into any trouble, unquote, while at the same time wanting to keep all options open by adding that, quote again, should a case arise in which we needed Japan's help, we would gladly ask for it and be grateful for it. This is very important. What he had in mind is that it should be Britain's initiative to ask for assistance, and this should also apply if Hong Kong or Wei were attacked by the Germans. So a very limited role that Grey had in mind for Japan. Right. Just the next one is for context to better understand. These are the naval figures for 1914. The American one is an estimate, otherwise they should be fairly accurate. So we can see that at the time of the outbreak of war, navally, militarily speaking, Japan was by far the dominant power in the region. Japan's early signals concerning the conflict were ambiguous. Foreign Minister Kato emphasized that Japan was not interested in European conflict. This is all the beginning of August 1914. The first half of August 1914. But Kato also stated that there would be Japanese support if the Germans attacked Hong Kong or Wei. So this is the Anglo-Japanese alliance. Australia and New Zealand had their own views about the Anglo-Japanese alliance, of course. And Frederick, as an example, Frederick Eggleston, an influential Australian writer, commented scathingly in March 1914, so a few months before, that, quote, a policy which disregards the Pacific, a British policy which disregards the Pacific, or leaves it to Japan, cannot be regarded as a truly imperial policy. The most outspoken group in Britain in favour of invoking Japanese assistance was the Admiralty. Hoping to bring all major ships from the Pacific to the European theatre as quickly as possible after the outbreak of the war, First Lord of the Admiralty Churchill pressed his view upon Prime Minister Asquith, writing to him on 14th August that, quote, the entry of Japan will of course make Pacific absolutely safe very soon. Any declaration against entry of Japan into war would harm. So a very clear statement there. The Foreign Office, by contrast, had been forewarned by the ambassador to Peking, Jordan at the time in early August, and this is up there, well I'll read it as well. I presume that Her Majesty's government had fully considered the probable seizure by Japan of the islands lying between this country and Australia in the event of her declaring war. It seems very advisable that pending the arrangement of a considered scheme of cooperation, the Japanese declaration of war should be put forward. What I would like to underline here is the words he chooses, a considered scheme of cooperation. So he basically suggests that the British government should be very careful and if employ Japan at all, consider the means. Germany, for her own reasons, hoped for Japan's neutrality in the European conflict. When Foreign Secretary Yago asked his ambassador in Tokyo, Count Rex, in early August about his impressions, the latter replied that, quote, should the war be confined to Europe, then Japan would presumably remain neutral, unquote. The German government, stressing that it did not seek war with Japan, suggested that, quote, if Japan, on account of the treaty with England, asks that Germany do nothing against English colonies, warship or commerce in the East, Germany will assent in return for corresponding promise from England. So Germany would keep out of the war if England keeps out of the war in the Pacific region or in the Far East. In anticipation of this, the commander of the East Asia Squadron, Admiral von Spee, had announced on 8th August that, quote, he, quote, will not attack British territory in East Asia, unquote. Even though the pre-war operational orders for the squadron had been to undertake cruiser warfare against British trade in the case of conflict, Germany was clearly not on a war footing in the Far East. So, in the example of von Spee, because even at that stage there was trouble communicating between Berlin and his squadron, that was in the South Seas at the time, but he anticipated the political situation. He knew what was going on, of course, in July 1914, and he announced that he would not attack British territory. So that was known at the time. Meanwhile, the tendency in Japan had moved towards war against Germany within a matter of days, to the surprise of the international community, perhaps, expressed by a Foreign Office official on 13th August, stating, "We did not at first realize how keen they were to come in. What the Japanese required, however, was a casus belli. Gray ultimately agreed to a statement that the two governments are of opinion that action is needed, but only, quote, but only if the action of Japan would not extend to the Pacific Ocean between the China Seas." Japan then issued an ultimatum on 15th August 1914 demanding that Germany vacate Tsingtao, and when the ultimatum lapsed on 23 August, war was declared. Neither the ultimatum nor the declaration of war mentioned geographic limitations of Japanese action, however. This caused irritation not only in Australia and New Zealand, but also in the United States. When the ultimatum of 15th August became known, the British ambassador in Washington reported, that's right there, is it yet? Barclay reported, I'm going to read this, "Japan's ultimatum to Germany has caused considerable concern. Press charges that Japan has seized opportunity of encroaching upon China, seizing possibly Pacific islands, with minimum of trouble herself. Stress is laid upon danger to United States strategical position should islands be occupied, namely Samoa and Ladrones, the Mariana Islands. These apprehensions, despite reassuring statement made by President that he is satisfied with Japan's good faith, seem to be shared in most circles." As a matter of fact, the US administration had made suggestions in early August regarding the neutralization of the entire Pacific Ocean. Secretary of State Bryan was informed by Gray that this might be too ambitious, but that he would welcome an American initiative in China. In the meantime, the British Official News Bureau, the official news outlet, had stated that it was, quote, "understood that the action of Japan will not extend to the Pacific," in anticipation of the Japanese announcement that never came. While the Japanese premier sent a message to the American people via the Independent magazine in New York, claiming on 24th August 1914, "As Premier of Japan, I have stated and now again state to the people of America and of the world that Japan has no ulterior motive, no desire to secure more territory, no thought of depriving China or other peoples of anything they now possess." Finally, President Wilson seems to have taken the various reassurances into account and decided not to interfere further, confident the United States would be consulted if further action was taken in the area. As a matter of fact, there was no further diplomatic interference at the time, so it seems that they just dropped the subject at this stage. Contrasting the Japanese reassurances on the international scene, Kato thought that the war was an, quote, "opportunity to sweep our bases in eastern waters and to advance the empire's position in the world," unquote. With hindsight, Kato's biographer commented that the British invitation was, and he writes, "was a godsend for Kato and those who wanted to take Japan into the war." Now to the war action itself. Early war action in the South Pacific was reserved to Britain and the Dominions, assisted by the French, who had sent 2 cruisers in support. German Samoa was taken on 30th August 1914 by a New Zealand expeditionary force, while Australians landed near Rabaul on 11th September, initiating the seizure of German New Guinea and the Bismarck Archipelago. So they all went relatively smooth from there in those areas. All German high-powered wireless stations had been dealt with by the British, Australians and New Zealanders by mid-September. All German high-powered, Japan had meanwhile stayed clear in the area. What happened in the Northern Islands actually is that the British knocked them out of the war, destroyed them and then sailed off. So they did occupy New Guinea and the Bismarck Archipelago, but in Yap, for example, they sailed by, destroyed the wireless station and then sailed on. Despite these successful operations, the strain on the Royal Navy became evident when the German squadron was unaccounted for over 1 month, and when Australian and New Zealand troops were getting ready to sail to Europe. Another blow was the destruction by the German squadron of the British submarine cable at Fanning Island in the Line Islands, and what is now the easternmost part of Kiribati, the vital part on the Imperial All Red route from British Columbia to Australia. I think I've actually got a map there. Yeah, there's Fanning Island right there. So there was the cable going from Vancouver to Fiji, North Island, and into Australia and New Zealand afterwards. Yeah, well, that's an even more global perspective of things. That's the All Red route encircling the globe. While the German position and plan to sail towards South America might have dawned on the British when Tahiti was attacked by von Spee on 22nd September, if not before, the Anglo-Japanese naval cooperation had by now been set well into motion. Thus, the Japanese created two dedicated South Sea squadrons, the first of which was sent out on 14th September, tasked with searching the Caroline and Marshall Islands for the German squadron and with incapacitating the German wireless station on Jalowit Island in the Marshalls. The second squadron joined the effort on 1st October. So Jalowit was then occupied by the Japanese on the 29th of September, followed by Yap on 7th of October, Truk on the Western Carolines on 12th of October, and essentially by the 14th of October, the Japanese control of the main bits of German Micronesia was complete. It took them a bit longer, of course, to secure it entirely, but essentially, in terms of communication, German Micronesia was knocked out of the war entirely and taken over by the Japanese by mid-October. And it became clear quite quickly as well that this was accepted as a fact in London, and even more than this. So the Admiralty wrote to the Foreign Office after the occupation of Yap, that is, that, and quote again, I'm quoting again, the Japanese government may be asked for continued occupation of Yap by their forces, continued occupation. Regarding the planned Australian expedition into German Micronesia, which had been planned since August but never carried out due to overstretch. So regarding the Australian expedition, to relieve the Japanese, Churchill wrote in all bluntness in a private letter to Colonial Secretary Harcourt. There's another one. The Admiralty would strongly deprecate any action towards Japan that would appear suspicious or ungracious. We are deriving benefit from their powerful and generous aid. They have intimated that their occupation is purely military and devoid of political significance, and there I trust we may leave the matter for the present. So it's quite interesting to see the international relations perspective that Churchill had at the time, being the First Lord. A similar, albeit more diplomatic view was expressed by Ambassador Green in Tokyo when he cabled, quote, "It appears to me that it would be at once politic and graceful if we offered them some signal mark of our confidence, without alarming American and Australian sentiment, to refrain from requesting at the present juncture the transfer to Great Britain of any islands which Japan may occupy for strategic reasons." So we can see that as the war progressed on, in those early days, the Admiralty and the Foreign Office sort of converged regarding their political positions. As for American sentiment, the United States, when inquiring about Jalowit, about the occupation, were reassured by the Japanese Ministry of Marine that, quote, that if there was any occupation, it was temporary and for military purposes only, unquote. 2 weeks later, the Japanese Navy Department was reported as having informally stated to the press, that comes from the ambassador in Tokyo, the US ambassador. So the Japanese Navy Department was quoted as saying that the other captures, so Yap and Truk and so forth, were regarded on the same basis as that of Jalowit, and that Japan had been acting in conjunction with Great Britain all the time. So another reassurance, if we will, even though America was kept out of the loop, I mean, was informed through Tokyo what had been happening without knowing what had been really happening on the ground. And the only ones who really knew what was happening at the time was the Japanese Navy and the British and the Royal Navy. As no further diplomatic action was taken in the US, it seems that the American administration had contented itself with those assurances. As a matter of fact, when Carter was interrogated by Parliament in December 1914, whether he had given any guarantees to the United States, regarding the limitation of Japanese action, he categorically stated that I have never given any guarantees to the American government. It is also consistent with this storyline of misunderstanding and miscommunication that the Australian government actually went ahead and prepared an expedition in November 1914 to relieve the Japanese, which was called off by Harcourt as follows. As Palau, Mariana, Caroline and Marshall Islands are at present in military occupation by Japanese who are at our request engaged in policing waters of Northern Pacific, we consider it most convenient for strategic reasons to allow them to remain in occupation for the present. And now comes the most important part, leaving the whole question of the future to be settled at the end of the war. If therefore the Australian expedition would confine itself to the occupation of German islands south of the equator, we would be glad.
2 minutes.
Okay, yep. Oh yeah, I'm almost done.
Good.
So how predetermined the permanence of the Japanese occupation of German Micronesia was is difficult to assess, but there are hints. It seems as though an escalating process of growing naval necessity by Britain was met by a parallel process of growing military preparedness and imperial appetite in Japan. This is also corroborated by a cable from Green to Grey in Tokyo, in which he claims that the Anglo-Japanese Naval Cooperation, quote, has led by common agreement and desire to the occupation of various points for strategic purposes, unquote. Ultimately, Kato claimed that, and he said, operations in the Pacific had been much more excessive than had at first been intended, which is of course true in a way because there was a certain the Royal Navy probably didn't estimate the situation or didn't assess the situation as well as they should have, and it took them much longer to drive the Germans out of the Pacific and to occupy the German islands. So there is of course truth to that. However, Cato also said at the time, said to Grey, that he hopes that Britain will bear in mind it will not be possible for the Japanese government to abandon and hand over the islands in question to another power when the time comes for considering final terms of peace. So in November 1914, he already says, we have taken these islands and we're not going to give them away. Now this is the last cable, and this is the last document I've got, which is interesting. Looking ahead into an imagined post-war future, so Harcourt then wrote a letter to the Governor-General of Australia and asked him, in the most gradual and diplomatic way, to begin to prepare the mind of your ministers for the possibility that at the end of the war, Japan may be left in possession of the northern islands, and that we, with everything south of the equator, as an imperial consolation, he writes, it will be a great gain to add German New Guinea to Papua and to have the whole of the Solomon Islands grouped under the British flag. So, to conclude, although the war was only a few months old, this is the first part, and yeah, that's the bit I just read. So to conclude, although the war was only a few months old, Japan had already seized the moment of British naval weakness and overstretch to remove an inferior Germany from the South Pacific, and had in the process quietly turned provisional strategic occupations into permanent ones. Having prioritized home waters defense over imperial concerns in the periphery or American uneasiness, Britain had continued on its trajectory of strategic withdrawal, while Japan had gained control of significant portions of the Pacific Ocean. The various movements, having consolidated into an informal at the time territorial arrangement, later proved to translate into the Versailles Peace Treaty with its mandate system. In the aftermath of the war, creating a drastically changed security landscape in the area. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Bart. So our next presenters are Frank Jacob and Ricardo Altieri, and they're going to be giving a paper on the Great War in the Middle East.
So the fact that we are presenting as a team is just a consequence of a seminar given on the history of the First World War in the Middle East, which turned out to be an article called Heroic Depiction versus Modern Slaughtering, and this is just a short survey of our thesis. The Middle East was depicted as a sideshow of the First World War, with lesser casualties in total as they were caused in the battles of the Western Front in Europe, more mobility and space. For individual heroic actions, it seemed to provide more space for traditional war tactics, which were no longer useful as a consequence of the highly modernized warfare in Europe. Edmund Allenby and Thomas E. Lawrence became the key figures of the Middle Eastern campaigns, let's say the heroic key figures, and Gallipoli should become an emblem for British failure during the war years. However, it was not only the military genius of the two commanders which was responsible for the success of their campaigns. They were fighting different kinds of war. The landing operation of Gallipoli was far more modern than one would assume by subsuming it to the Middle Eastern war scenario. The region itself was never a homogeneous region, but in contrast left sufficient space for different tactics and the use of modern technology at the same time. Soldiers fighting in the Middle East could face trench warfare, gas war, attacks by planes, heavy artillery, machine gun fire, barbed wire on the one hand, but also cavalry and camel attacks, guerrilla warfare, surprise attacks, and ambushes on the other. So here we see some bigger Ottoman guns that were captured by the British Army. So also the Ottoman Army was really equipped in a modern way. The Middle East thereby resembled the art of war of the European Western and Eastern Front at the same time, and could be seen as a semi-modern war as a whole, a fact that the present paper wants to underline. Therefore, we will compare different campaigns and the use of modern technology to show why specific battlefields highly resembled the problematic situation of Western European battlefields, while others left sufficient space for the creation of heroes and legends alike. After a discussion of the Gallipoli operation, we will switch the focus to the more mobile campaigns on the Arabian Peninsula to have a close look at the tactics used by Lawrence of Arabia. We thereby aim to show the diversity of the Middle East as a theater of the First World War, especially to strengthen the demand for more detailed studies of these war spaces, which should no longer simply focus on the failure of Gallipoli or the hero of the Arabian War scene. There are more others which will be discussed in the article, but not in our survey today. Gallipoli is mostly known as one of the darkest hours of British military history and is well described by Peter Doyle and Matthew R. Bennett as a costly gamble intended to knock Turkey out of the war and to command the main supply line to Russia. Much has been said about the reasons for the failure. A combination of factors led to the failure of this plan, most particularly the ineffectiveness of naval artillery fire against land targets, the presence of mobile batteries on both the European and Asian shores, and ineffective minesweeping by the Allies. This ultimately caused an escalation of the conflict and a commitment to deploy troops in an invasion of the Gallipoli Peninsula. Furthermore, the geographic setting was responsible for the problems the soldiers had to face after the landing began. The local inadequacy of water supplies, the steepness of slopes, the incision of ravines, the precipitous nature of the cliffs, and the density of vegetation made the life of the troops as miserable as the higher positions of the Ottoman soldiers and their machine guns. However, also the personal factor was responsible for the disastrous developments. While Sir Ian Hamilton was precisely the sort of commander that one might have chosen to lead the Dardanelles expedition, the final campaign proved him to be indecisive and lacking a firm hand with his subordinates. He was not able to give clear orders or to become a strong and energetic leader for the landing troops, why he finally lost the public and governmental belief in his capabilities as a military commander at all. If you don't achieve something, you're a bad commander. The withdrawal in humiliation and defeat was also due to the inexperience of the troops, which were sent from different parts of the empire to execute a poorly planned mission. The only regiment that was successful was a Burka regiment, which was only stopped by friendly fire. The general staff had not possessed sufficient intelligence information about the situation on the peninsula, and the quality of the maps was really bad. Despite this lack, the mission was started, especially because the Dardanelles have been a strategic target in the war planning of the Royal Navy from the beginning of the war. In addition to the deadlock on the Western Front, where the trenches were digged out, Her Majesty's government appeal for assistance from Russia early in January 1915 drove the important British figures of government and navy, including Winston Churchill or David Lloyd George, to favor a fleet operation against Istanbul by sending a fleet through the Straits, which would consequently force one of the Central Powers out of war. That seemed reasonable, but they didn't count in the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire was not unprepared, and the military staff knew that the Dardanelles might be the target of the enemy. Liman von Sanders and Enver Pasha were well prepared to welcome the British and French landing forces, and Sanders' ideas were formed before the Allied naval attempts of February-March 1915 to break through, and he stressed the need to defend the artillery of the Straits against Allied naval and land attacks long before they started. Consequently, at no time after 17th August 1914 were the Dardanelles defenses unready to receive an attack. And the British underestimation of the Ottoman enemy should cost many lives. In contrast to the assumptions of the military planners in London, and here I quote Edward J. Erickson, who wrote on the Ottoman army, the Ottoman General Staff sent its best combat infantry divisions to defend the jungle of the empire. These divisions were well trained, well led, and very effective. The Gallipoli Peninsula itself was the most heavily defended area of the Ottoman Empire, and the defensive planning for its retention encompassed years of effort and refinement. The principal tactical commanders were extremely energetic and experienced in the kind of fighting found on the peninsula. So they were fighting against the cream of the Ottoman Empire. And the campaign was doomed from its start to resemble the bloody war of Western Front, a fact that was also supported by the terrain, which left only room for a stalemate leading to a trench warfare. Anyway, War Minister Herbert Kitchener was optimistic because he did not expect any resistance from the Ottoman side, a miscalculation that might have been a consequence of imperial arrogance as well. Hamilton and his staff were consequently assembled in piecemeal fashion, so they met the first time at the train station and briefed only vaguely about the environment. The commander of the Mediterranean Expeditionary Force therefore had to admit that the peninsula, and I quote, looks a much tougher nut to crack than it did over the map. Additionally, no surprise factor could help Hamilton to gain an advantage because von Sanders had already heard rumors about an expedition and was able to get even more detailed information out of Egyptian newspapers because they talked very open about the British war plans. Finally, it seemed not to be surprising at all when British as well as Anzac troops landed on the southern and western parts of the Gallipoli Peninsula. Having no special equipment for an amphibious landing operation, the soldiers had to land by getting towed to the shore in simply rowboats. That leaves time to kill them until they reach the shore. There, the well-prepared units of the 5th Ottoman Army were already waiting to do their bloody job. Finally, the British assumptions regarding the Army's fighting powers, which should have been questions before the landing occurred, were about to have disastrous consequences. The Ottoman soldiers started immediately to open fire against the approaching British and Australian troops, 4:20 in the morning, and from the beginning of the operation it was clear that it would not become the easy job the military staff had believed in. Hamilton's men had to face machine guns and barbed wire. Consequently, their situation resembled the one of the soldiers in France. Hamilton seemed to recognize the hopeless situation when he writes, "We are struggling like drowning mariners in a sea of chaos. Chaos in the offices, chaos on the ships, chaos in the camps, chaos along the wharves." The military staff was looking for alternatives to end the stalemate, which should last until the end of the operation, while the Gallipoli campaign, like the Western and Eastern Front in Europe, reached a chemical level of warfare as well. The leading officers speculated about the use of gas, which was finally not used until a year later in Palestine in the Middle East, but the hopeless situation on the peninsula made people think loud about the use of gas as well. While the Entente had hoped to overcome the trench warfare of the Western Front by the landing operation, it opened a second stalemate scenario which resembled the technological warfare of the rest of Europe. Consequently, more than 30,000 respirators and 10,000 gas helmets, that are Australian troops posing with the new gas helmets, were shipped to the battlefields of the peninsula because one feared an Ottoman gas attack as well. There was an indication that the Germans had sent chemicals to the Ottoman Empire as well, through Romania. All in all, the Gallipoli campaign was similar to those fought in Western Europe, and regardless of the fact that the operation was a fiasco, it was a modern one. Modern warfare, with all its technological possibilities to kill the enemy, had determined the battlefield at Gallipoli. This was no spot for heroic battles. It was a spot to die from machine gun fire, artillery shells, or as a consequence of the harsh weather in the winter, for which the British troops were not prepared well. When the governmental leaders as well as the military staff recognized the failure, they decided to evacuate the troops between December 1915 and January 1916, and this operation, in stark contrast with the landings in April and August 1915, was well planned. However, this was just one side of the war in the Middle East, and here comes the second side.
Yeah, it's talking about Lawrence of Arabia. Compared to Gallipoli, another setting of the First World War, was able to create a hero who had to wage a totally different kind of warfare. Thomas E. Lawrence, who became a gallant figure of British guerrilla warfare in the Great War, was also promoted by the exotic setting he was fighting in, as well as by the stylization through the modern mass media. Lawrence had been no military tactician who was trained for guerrilla warfare in the Arabian Desert, as a fact that he recognized by himself. I was not practiced in that technique. I was unlike a soldier, hated soldiering. Of course, I had read the usual books, too many books, Clausewitz and Chermini, Mayhem and Falk, had played at Napoleon's campaigns, worked at Hannibal's tactics, and the wars of Belisarius like any other man at Oxford. But I had never thought myself into the mind of a real commander compelled to fight a campaign of its own. Despite this lack of experience, he was a man that could be made a myth, one that is still repeated in modern works about Lawrence of Arabia, who set the desert on fire. While the Arabian fight against the Ottoman rule was depicted in romantic ways, the support of the Royal Navy for resupply as well as air support was needed to win the battles. The Arab irregulars might have been a powerful force, but they were as unable to defend a point or line as they are to attack it. Lawrence must have realized that in a standard fight against the better disciplined Turks, the Arabs would be doomed. Therefore, he reacted by starting a guerrilla warfare for which the environment was predestined. How would the Turks defend all that? He's talking about 130,000 square miles. No doubt by a trench line across the bottom if the Arabs were an army attacking with banners displayed, but suppose they were an influence, a thing invulnerable, intangible, without front or back, drifting about like a gas. Armies were like plants, immobile as a whole, firm-rooted, nourished through long stems to the head. The Arabs might be a vapor, blowing where they listed. It seemed that a regular soldier might be helpless without target. He would own the ground he sat on, and what he could poke his rifle at. Lawrence also recognized the potential of such a campaign for the total scenario of the First World War. A man who could fight well by himself made generally a bad soldier, and these champions seemed to me no material for our drilling. But if we strengthen them by light automatic guns of the Lewis type, to be handled by themselves, they might be capable of holding their hills and serving as an efficient screen behind which we could build up. While the press explained the heroic fight of the Arabs under the leadership of a noble Englishman to the world public by describing the war in Arabia as a conflict, where a single man was still able to make a difference, and thereby proving that the old way of warfare might still exist, Lawrence himself had already recognized that also a guerrilla war needed modern technology to become successful, because otherwise his forces were not able to hold conquered spots. Working with old tactics and modern technology, the war in Arabia was definitely semi-modern, like the conflict in the Middle East as a whole. While the troops of Gallipoli faced the cruelties of the modern technological warfare, almost including gas attacks, Lawrence, in the southern parts of the Middle East, like Allenby in Palestine, was able to act fast and use his higher level of mobility. His operations were like naval warfare in their mobility, their ubiquity, their independence of bases and communications, in their ignoring of ground features, of strategic areas, of fixed directions, of fixed points. This provided the stage for the creation of a myth, as the war in Arabia was simple and individual, and could make a hero out of Lawrence. It was not only the bad planning that made Gallipoli a failure. The geographical setting of the campaign, as well as the fact that the British and Anzac soldiers had to face the best equipped and modernized troops of the Ottoman Empire, led by capable officers, made this the most modern battlefield of the Middle Eastern theater of war. Taking these different places, scenarios, and outcomes into consideration, it seems to be suitable to call the Great War in the Middle East as a whole a semi-modern war. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Frank and Ricardo. And next we have Dr. Mark Gilbert, who's going to be giving a talk on Wartime Government of India Act of 1960. Mark?
How can we do this?
Sure.
Just stick it in. And this is called Global Warming Science. Or something. No. No, that's the oh, there's self-destruction. Hi, like Dr. David Allen, I don't like to read my paper, but I notice there's a cameraman there who may go blind as I move back and forth. So I'll stay away from my paper as much as I can. An act of hubris, I can always start reading it. But the important thing is that it was written after actually collecting 2,875 pages of documents and memoirs and newspapers over the last month. So I very rapidly put it all together for this presentation in terms of the written form, and you'll see all sorts of additional pronouns that don't need to be there, and prepositions. And please forgive me for that. But I'll send everyone a copy of a much more cleaned up version. But what I'm really going to talk about has its origins in the wonderful people of Capital Normal University and the Chinese Academy for Social Science, who invited me to give a paper on the place of India in World War I, which got me to think more and more about the global aspects of World War I, and I thank them for that. Also, the National Endowment for Humanities grant program here, which enabled me to conduct the research that I just finished. What I'm really talking about is something called racial politics. Politics is the distribution of resources. Racial politics is or enabling the distribution of resources according to benefit one group or another, largely through the politics of difference. So like nationalism, racism is, as we just heard, vaporous. You know, it's very hard to nail down what we mean by when we say nationalism. It's also hard to nail down what we call racism. Racial thinking is not the same thing as saying, I don't like the color of your skin. It's saying that the people who have darker skin than me are not worthy of the resources which I instead should be able to enjoy at a higher level. So this is about how racial thinking, part of a much larger envelope we call imperialism, leads the British during World War I to make a series of errors, almost all connected and expressing the same form of racial thinking, amongst other ideas of dominance, that lead Britain to destroy its own empire. So the topic of this, the title of this paper actually is, I can read it to you, or John didn't put the new title in, which is fine, which is Self-Destruction, the Great War, Colonies of Settlement, and the Fate of the British Empire. What is a colony of non-settlement is the other part, the other nomenclature needed to understand this paper. When we think of the British Empire, we think of Australia, New Zealand, and of India, and possibly Egypt, but we don't realize that these are very different places within the British imperial mind. The British imperial mind looks at colonies of settlement as places which were empty before white people came and made them fruitful. Now, of course, there were other people there. The American colonies, there were actually Indians whose ideas were worthy of inclusion in the U.S. Constitution, the Iroquois Constitution. So there were people there, but they are considered to be non-people in a vacant land in which settlers from the mother country are settled. That means there are very few racial minorities, and it doesn't really matter in actual fact whether you marry into them, because race is not an issue visibly in a colony of settlement because of the white majority is not threatened, for the most part. In a tropical dependency, or a colony of non-settlement, it is absolutely necessary to maintain white racial dominance. Why? Because these are all colonies of conquest in places in which there's only going to be a tiny minority of white settlers, of actual representatives of the imperial race. And that means not only that non-whites cannot have a place, but it also means whites who mix with the local races, or more importantly, become poor, merchants that go bankrupt. These have no place in those societies. And in actual fact, the racial divisions of these people, we used to call them Anglo-Indians, or British domicile in India, actually had a ranking of clubs. If you were all white, hadn't lived in India long, you could be a member of X Club. If you were of long time, generations of settlers in India, merchants rather than official classes, but had married, well, more than a drop of local blood, you had to go to another one. And if you were mostly, if you had two grandparents that were Indian in blood, you had your own club. No other person, of course, in the upper section would ever be considered socially acceptable. What kind of system do we call that in India amongst Hindus? Caste system. Perhaps inappropriately, but nonetheless, that's what it is. So violence and racial discrimination, actual racial superiority, is extremely important in a colony of non-settlement. There's a problem, of course, here in the British Empire. It's a liberal empire, in which the purpose of that empire is to bring people up in civilizational level, at least to buy your goods, as Thomas Macaulay said in 1835. But the idea is that if you're going to train people to raise up through levels of civilization, they will eventually inherit the colony, or it's going to happen naturally. Surely it's not possible to run an empire like India with 2,000 British civil servants. That's not possible. You're going to have to rely on subordinate officials who are going to ultimately learn the skills necessary to be the upper class officials that are running. These are what we would call inevitable. And they are inevitable to only a very small number of British liberals. Most British, like the United States, most people in the country of Britain are very conservative. In their civil service overseas, the Indian civil service, They are stridently politically conservative, and they are extremely racially conscious, and you'd expect them to be. Gandhi, when he went to England, was lauded by Englishmen, even those whose industries he was going to destroy by actually allowing the textile industry to grow on its own. They lauded him for his ideals. But in India, Gandhi was a, you'll pardon the word, nigger. That's all. And this impressed Gandhi so much, by the way, this is why he embraced nonviolence. Because he knew that imperialism is a product of an environment. You can change that person's view of their environment with love. And in fact, we heard about this already. So Gandhi could get past the bounds of racism, even as a colonial subject person. But the colonialist cannot get past that. Their lives are entwined with their jobs, which are directly connected to their sole possession of the highest echelons of administration. Now, so what you have really is a twinning of racial power. You have conservatives in parliament who will never stand for a black person to sit in parliament. So the Prime Minister of Britain in 1888 said openly. On the other hand, you have an Indian civil service that cannot bear to think that any Indian would ever be fit for a high office in India. These are all quotations from literature. So with this double whammy of a parliament and an imperial civil service that are wedded to racialized thinking about the incapacity of, in particular, Asians, but it applies to Egyptians as well, to ever replace them, means that any effort on their part to even consider independence or self-government is a fantasy. And it's very, very poor form to encourage that fantasy, because it will in effect lower the imperial race. I've always wondered how that's possible. I mean, if you're a race, you're superior, so how can you become inferior? Well, that's one of the wonderful complexities of racial theory. In actual fact, the leadership of the British Conservative Party, principally Lord Salisbury, absolutely believed that the British race would be destroyed if they gave any political concessions to them. Now you can imagine how the people in Egypt and India felt about this kind of thinking. In other words, they've been conquered by force and then humiliated by racial subjugation. This is not a good situation to have in a place where you don't have a lot of troops, where you don't have a lot of civil service. How do you manage this? Well, I think, what's it? How do you share a cage with a lion? Very carefully, like that. But the problem is the iron fist must always be inside the velvet glove. And the problem is that iron fist would come out very often in a slam dunk whenever Indian or Egyptian aspirations rose up. And the result of that was, while there were plenty of opportunities for slow constitutional political reform, these were always 20 years overdue by the time they were approved by the British government. And this is called too little, too late. But the result of this was, as you'll see in a second, that Britain had already used up all its political capital by the time the war started, and then promptly dumped all the rest of it during the course of the war without, totally oblivious to its effects. Because, of course, these relations in their minds were immutable. They couldn't be changed. So I'm going to give you a little rundown of how this happened, and its origins a little bit, but not too much. Then into how this destruction took place. And I call it self-destruction because it wasn't necessary. It could have easily been avoided. And in the end, largely because of Gandhi's strategy, it only took another 40 more or 30 more years. But yes, the British one day, as you will probably remember from the film Gandhi, the British did actually walk out. And Indian and British relations remained healthy and have continued to remain healthy ever since independence. But let's go back to when they blew it, when the British Empire was destroyed in the tropical dependencies and neocolonialism begins. Because the decolonization begins after World War I. It doesn't begin after World War II. That's, I think, a terrible misunderstanding of history to look at the kind of decolonization of Africa after the Second World War as being the real tenor of decolonization. You know, decolonization starts in 1922 when the WAFT was given the independence of Egypt. That's the beginning of the end. And of course, in 1922, that same year, Gandhi declares India politically independent. That's the independence of India in a Satyagraha campaign that fails, but not without that declaration that freed the hearts and minds of the Indian people. So how did these mistakes start unfolding? Well, first of all, why? British racial theory goes back probably beyond the, some kind of Anglo-Saxon mentality, which you can actually see on the halls of the Foreign Office in Britain after they were redone in 1919, where Anglo-Saxon princesses are seen with ships being loaded with young Anglo-Saxon men to get on boats to conquer the world. These images were recreated just for the Foreign Office to kind of bring back the idea that Britain is great after the tragedy of the war. But it starts, as we say, way back when, probably, certainly with the conquest of Ireland, where it became essential for the conquest of Ireland for the Irish people to become, again, that nasty word, niggers.
White.
No more than that. In fact, Charles Gordon, Chinese Gordon, said that actually the Irish people are treated worse and under worse conditions than the Indians of the South Asian coast. Building on these values, we have, of course, social Darwinism. There's also the need to bring science and technology into administration, science and technology that's Western in orientation, meaning that no Indian has it by definition. And as Indians begin to gain it, they're told that they still don't have the same skills that Westerners have. In actual fact, by about 1900, there were more educated Indians in Western philosophy and civilization than there were people in England. Of course, the Indian population is larger, but one of the arguments was there are not enough Western educated Indians to replace Britain in the rule of their empire. No, there were plenty. And in fact, one of the achievements of the Indian nationalist movement is that it produced two generations who are actually capable of running India. And so when independence does come, India, Pakistan, and later Bangladesh, there are people who know how to run a DAFTA, right, a Western-style office. They know how to do that. Now, how does this have a bearing on World War I? Because of these racial theories, there was a very slow constitutional reform movement with all the reforms 20 years behind the times in terms of expectations of Indians. This led to tragedy, both in Egypt, by the way, and in India in 1906, with 1905 and 1906. In Egypt, the Denshawai incident, in which English hunters shot at animals outside an Egyptian village and killed Egyptian villagers, who then ran out and killed some of the hunters, for which they were all executed by the imperial government. And in India, Bengal was partitioned into a Hindu and Muslim provinces for purely practical reasons. But of course, Indians didn't look that way, especially Bengalis, who share a common culture. The result in India was suicide bombing terrorist campaign for more than 3 years, in which Indian women would strap themselves with dynamite and walk into a British club and blow it up. The world has really, I don't think, ever seen a terrorist campaign as violent and as deadly as in Bengal. The problem was this split the Indian nationalist movement between those who wanted Swaraj, self-rule, now, immediately, and by any means possible, including violence, and those old-line moderates who wanted to continue to pursue moderate reform. So this is all happening in 5 years preceding World War I. The British know they're in trouble. They try one more installment of reform, which, again, is 20 years too late. But the Indian nationalist movement is already divided. So this is a perfect opportunity for a real generous change, a way of reinventing the British Empire in India and probably saving it for 80 years, who knows? Well, what happened was, when the war was declared, the British had to ask all the colonies to give them everything they've got. And India gave Britain everything they had. Gandhi participated in raising over £100 million for the British war effort, and asked why. He said, look, we want more political concessions from the British, but if we put a price on them, we are simply disloyal, just the way they think of us. So we must do this. We must be loyal, because that's what citizens of a great empire are. It's what makes us eligible for any rewards for our support. And this position so influenced the British, they even talked for a minute about a new view about India. But then, wartime is a shaky place. And, maybe we shouldn't have controversial subjects to be discussed during the war. 1 year later, in 1915, Parliament introduced a bill to alter the administration of India with no consultation in India at all. Indians, of course, went ballistic over this. How can you do this? You are thanking us for our support, and they British were, but your actual result is we're still being shut out of the administration of the country. The same year, Anglo-Indians, civilians, were allowed to volunteer to be part of the 1.5 million force of Indians who'd been in the Indian Army and shipped to Mesopotamia, actually to every theater of the First World War. Anglo-Indians were allowed to do so. If you had a drop of British blood in you, you could actually volunteer to serve and die all over the world. But Indians, and I love the French call this authentic French, authentic Indians, they're not allowed to volunteer and serve their country. Now, that's just two. I can enumerate 20 of these things, one after another, year by year, in which something was done in which the British could simply have extended Indian representation. For example, the Imperial Conference of 1917, which actually admitted that maybe India could be included in the benefits that were going to be given to settler colonies as serving part of the empire as a result of their help during the First World War. But guess who gets to be appointed the Indian representatives? Two conservative Indians. Who goes to the Paris Peace Conference representing India? Versailles? The Maharaja of Bikaner. A wonderful man, but not really someone who you'd say he's the head of the Indian delegation. And of course, Gandhi refuses ever to go to these imperial conferences until about 11 years later. And then they tell him he can't be the sole representative. He has to stand next to the Maharaja of Bikaner. A Maharaja is not a representative of British India. In fact, a Maharaja is not in British India at all. They are rulers of semi-independent autonomous states by treaty linked to Britain. So we have these series, and in each case, legitimate Indian opinion, which the British have always promised would, since 1858, to make the empire more efficient. Indians should be brought into the governance of their own country. This is 1858. They had a rebellion I think some of you have heard of. And the point is they didn't want another one, and they wanted to consult Indians so they knew what Indians felt, and that wouldn't happen. What's really interesting is that Lord Curzon, a very conservative viceroy of India, when the Indian delegation is to come to the Treaty of Versailles, Lord Montagu, don't worry if you get lost with the names, it's the point that matters. Lord Montagu drafts a resolution saying that they will come here to talk about peace, but they will also be talking about the ultimate independence of the subcontinent. And Curzon rewrites it to say that at some future time, more political concessions will be offered. The political concession that was offered Indians at the end of World War I, most of you probably know, was a thing called the Montagu-Chelmsford Reforms of 1919. These were actually the kinds of liberal political reforms that were actually originally mentioned in 1892. But conservatives in Britain and the Indian Civil Service would not accept it even then. Then they wouldn't accept it in 1909, the next reforms. And then in 1919, the Indians got it an entire generation later. And it was not accepted. And the result was Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi became the leader of the Indian independence movement in rejection of the failure of British promises. Some of you have seen the movie Gandhi, or know what the Amritsar massacre was. And that was because while they were preparing these reforms, the Indian Civil Service got the government to actually eliminate virtually all Indian political enemies. Because the war had been so bitter, Britain felt so weak, they still didn't trust the Indian population, even in peacetime, to be entrusted with civil liberties. And Gandhi calls for a hartal, that is a work stoppage. And as part of this work stoppage, an incident occurs in Amritsar, which the local military authorities believe can only be resolved by making a political statement, which is opening fire on unarmed civilians and killing as many as 1,400 people. By the way, when the investigation into this event in 1922, well, about 1922, was concluded, Lord Montagu, who was Secretary of State for India, was almost attacked in Parliament for even investigating the nature of this massacre. In other words, there were a few people with sympathies towards Indian reform, but they never were able to change the pattern. After that, Winston Churchill, actually, became conservative leader, and like Lord Salisbury, would not countenance the idea of Indian independence until 1945, when he was asked, why are you supporting Indian independence now? That is, after he's out of power. Why are you supporting Indian independence? And he said, because since 1931, we've given so many powers to Indians that it's not worth having anymore. Meaning, power over people and resources is why you have an empire. And if you don't, there's no point holding on to it. Rather sad moment. But what I'd like to, the reason why I got interested in this is we asked the question, why do countries go to war? We had a wonderful presentation on the question of peace, which is the idea is the cost of starting a war, and then the cost of remaining in what you have conquered. And the problem is, what Gandhi was stressing, and what he stressed in a fictional debate with Osama bin Laden, which I'll be happy to send to anyone who signs that pad of paper that has law. It's a fictional discussion between Osama bin Laden and Mohandas Gandhi, created by Professor Parekh, an Indian professor, using the lines of Osama bin Laden and Gandhi. And Osama bin Laden talks about how Muslims are victims of European imperialism. And Gandhi said, that's funny, because everything you say about the Muslim world you want to create is just another British Empire. Only it's a Muslim empire that will conquer non-Muslims and will do nasty things to them, etc., etc., etc. He said, I'm a victim, he said, Gandhi said. I am a victim of colonialism. You want an imperialist state. And of course, this is before the ISIS, where the Islamic State was created. That is, sorry, it was written about 10 years ago. And sure enough, here we have a state that says, I know what the Quran says, but I think it's okay to kill Muslims and Christians. It's okay. The Quran, of course, says the opposite, but now anyone who's not suitable for citizenship in an absolutist Islamic state doesn't have even the right to life. And this is remarkable. We're watching not a religious war. This is not a religious war. It's certainly un-Quranic from our perspective as liberal Muslims, certainly. But the idea is that war comes because it fulfills interests. In the short term, it's always a perception that fulfills interest. In actual fact, as we heard in one of the very first papers today, and in yours, in actual fact, is that it was Professor Rohinder. He said, ask a veteran whether the war was worth it.
2 minutes.
Yeah, I'm done, thank you. I only need 30 seconds. And the thing is, name us a war in which the veterans felt the outcome was worth the sacrifice. If you've seen Al Pacino's 1776, you would say not the American Revolution. If you look at the Vietnam War, well, there's some diehards who still think we could have won, right? And maybe they're right. I'm not stating in judgment of anyone, but most veterans don't know what the heck it was about, even when they were fighting it. And unfortunately, there are thousands of Europeans serving in ISIS, and there are thousands of people oppressing other people in the name of all sorts of humane values in their minds. And yes, it continues. So we can look at Kony's army, in the Congo, say these guys are insane. But look in the mirror, any nation, look in the mirror, and look at who you are oppressing. Rohingya in Burma, a handful of Muslim merchants in Sri Lanka, Tamils, of course, in Sri Lanka, who are much happier at peace, we thought, and are now engaging in war again. That is, the majority populations are engaging in war. So this gives us a lot to think about, and I still have like 15 seconds, I think. And I hope I didn't talk too fast, and we have it on tape, and my paper is right here. It's in English, but we will have it translated eventually, and get a copy to you via email. And for that, I thank you for your patience and attention. Happy to answer any questions. Thank
Why don't we have the presenters come up, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. So, questions? Trevor, I saw you look at me for a second. Do you have a question? Yeah, go ahead. Yes.
Mark, it's really, fascinating when you
Yeah.
took the 1919, and I've said in my own invitation that it was too late, too little.
Yes, too late, too little.
Even for the Northwest frontier.
Yes,
But you took it back to 1892.
yes,
That there was a talk.
yes, because that's my doctoral dissertation.
Amazing.
Yes, it is amazing, but there was a proposal for the expansion of provincial governance to be simply nominated, so that Indians could be nominated to serve on provincial administrative councils. And in 1890, Lansdowne, who actually brokered the Anglo-Japanese alliance, said, we can't stop there. Indians have advanced to a point now that they deserve a generous measure. Let's allow Indians to elect their local representatives and then elect members to the Viceroy's Executive Council. And Lord Salisbury said, where's this guy's mind? In the bar at Brooks? Brooks was the liberal political club. The people who brought you the reform of 1832. In other words, people who really believe in the extension of political power. And they quashed all of those moderate proposals. Then Morley, in 1909, actually does worse, because it does bring a little more representation, but then introduces the idea of separate electorates for Hindus and Muslims, because it's easy politically, rather than work out a more satisfactory reform scheme. And then in 1919, they give Indians complete power of the provincial government, but they hold all the high administrative offices for whites. So that's not good progress for a civilization that actually is based on the idea, the Whig idea, of the slow extension of constitutional power, which Indians were all trained in. That's the tradition they were trained in. And even Tillich turns moderate in order to try not to get the British to hurt them, and instead love them.
Okay, Pierre had a question, and then Jim, and then Ryan.
I have a question for Frank and Ricardo. This might be slightly beyond the scope of your research, but to the extent that you can, could you tell me if the World War I in the Middle East ultimately has any kind of an impact on like the Arab way of war? I'm looking at let's say,
It definitely has a modernization in the way of warfare. For example, the Arabs used to be the victims of air raids before, and now they understood the value of air power as well, because Lawrence combined these attacks that were depicted in the movie when they attacked Aqaba from the desert side and run in, but it was not this antiquated war style anymore. They combined Navy fire, for example, air power, and the horse and the camel at the same time. So what we see is a combination of, let's say, rather traditional war tactics of mobility and modern technology. So if you want to put it on a very trivial level, you could call it an Arabian Blitzkrieg.
Which was also semi-modern.
Yeah, it is
It was
semi-modern.
mostly horses.
Okay, Jim?
For Bart, you had made the point that within 4 months, the Japanese had, for all practical purposes, occupied the islands of Micronesia. And of course, that was 9 years after the Russo-Japanese War, where the Japanese reigned over there. So I'm wondering, within your consideration, within your paper, had you considered the momentum beginning with the Meiji Restoration in 1898 and the decades following of Japan toward a greater Asian presence?
Well, there is a historiography of the Japanese southward movement. This is a debated question. There is There is Mark Peachy with his Japanese, like Nanyo, Japanese southward expansion book. I'm not in a position to answer the decades prior to World War I, but it seems from things that I've read that that the Japanese expansionist discourse was actually not embracing the idea of going into the island world. There was a southern expansion discourse, but it was a very genuinely Japanese interpretation of the area, of geography, more land-based, more well focused on Southeast Asia possibly. So in this respect, it might have come as a surprise. Well, my interpretation is that it was an opportunist event, taking the advantage of one particular moment in time and expanding into the area. So one can think of how this fits into the Japanese expansionist discourse, but maybe it doesn't quite do so.
Well,
Yeah,
maybe
yeah,
actually I can
I
answer
can
that.
add something.
Yeah, the reason I bring it up is, you know, within an operational framework, from a start to an end of a 4-month period, moving into all of the Micronesian, effectively,
Yeah.
all of the Micronesian area, at the same time, they're moving into Weihai Way.
Yeah.
You see, so that's
Right.
a lot of activity in a short 4-month period. In those times, when you didn't have the technology for planning and movement and operations that you have today.
Militarily, they were certainly prepared. They were prepared in the mid of August 1914, and all the ships were actually there. So it must be assumed that they were ready to sail. But
This pops my question.
And the plannings were ongoing since the end of the Russo-Japanese War.
That's why I
Because
brought it up.
we see, that's the field I'm generally in, the Russo-Japanese War created a struggle over power and influence between the army and the navy.
Yes, indeed.
And the army had this traditional continental approach against Russia, still after 1905, even if they were discussing whether Russia or China. Finally, they decided to go into China instead of Russia or the Soviet Union, because it seemed to be the easier target.
Yeah.
And the Navy designed something that was already discussed around 1900 and published by high Navy admirals in Pan-Asianist journals. How far south shall we go? There were plannings to conquer the whole of Australia, and yeah, at least on paper. So
Okay,
it
yeah.
was something like
The Pan-Asian,
Yeah.
Pan-Asian approach.
Yeah.
Well, I'm
How
glad you,
far?
I'm glad you asked this question because something I've been studying is the Japanese southward movement that ends up in Assam. In actual fact, the co-prosperity sphere and the southern movement was never supposed to go past Vietnam. And the fact that they were able to conquer Burma was an enormous surprise. Let me finish.
Not go past Malaysia and Indonesia?
Oh, absolutely. The point I'm trying to get at, is that there was a dispute within the ministry of those who saw the resources of Burma and Malaya and things like that as being paramount and worthy of going for, and then others that said no. And this is the ministry that's conceiving of the co-prosperity sphere. But in actual fact, wartime conditions after Pearl Harbor, it was just so easy to do it that they just went. But the disconnect was so great that the officials of this ministry in Burma were telling the Burmese they were going to set up an independent government and actually believed it. Whereas no one in the ministry by the end of the war had any conception of real alliances in Indonesia or in Burma, that these were just supposed to be colonies of exploitation.
So Mark,
Yeah.
okay, hold on, so you're saying that Indonesia, I mean, to me, the whole idea, one of the reasons for going into
Yes.
Southeast Asia
Yes.
is to get
Tin, oil, and
all
gold.
Indonesian
Tin,
oil,
oil,
and then
and
like tin from Malaysia,
Right.
Malaya, and then oil from Indonesia, because you don't really have oil anywhere else, right? And Vietnam was kind of the means to get down to,
Right.
and the whole idea of attacking Pearl Harbor was to get the Americans out of the area long enough to complete that. So you're saying that at one point that really wasn't in the cards, that
No.
Indonesia was
Now,
not?
first of all, remember the attack on Indonesia, by the way, World War II is caused by the Japanese occupation of Vietnam. I mean, if you want an assassination, you want a spark, because it leads to the American cutoff of oil of Japan when they've already cut off its iron. So what I'm trying to say is that in the planning for the concept of a co-prosperity sphere, the idea in the South of getting that far south and then incubating nationalist movements there to work as junior partners of Japan towards a higher civilization, which is what the co-prosperity sphere was supposed to be about. That was something that put this conquest idea, and even invading India, was not on anybody's screen before Pearl Harbor.
Okay, hang on, this is something you two.
We can continue.
You go at it at the break, okay? Brian, question?
Yeah, first of all, excellent presentation. Frank and Ricardo, you mentioned a couple of other instances that you were discussing in the article that's not in the presentation. Just give us a very brief reason.
For example, the Palestine campaigns were other campaigns of movement, and when Allenby took over after the first, let's say, rather unsuccessful campaigns in Gaza, he also was able to keep up morale of the troop, and he got refreshments, especially from India at that time, and then could move on. But this war, especially in Palestine, also in Mesopotamia, was not this classical war of non-movement we see in the First World War, like in Gallipoli. It was rather attack, counterattack. Something we can see in the Second World War in Africa again. We don't see something where we have focus or fixed stalemates where they're trying to overcome the other side with artillery fire and so on. We have movement and back movement. The problem is, if you don't have a spot you can defend, which means in some mountainous regions you can do that, in the desert you cannot. And the first Australian troops coming to defend the Suez Canal had the problem how to dig a trench in the desert. So they were just lying there facing the enemy on the other side. So in general, Palestine, Mesopotamia are the classical, I would say, wars of mobility.
Frank, for a later short question, could you bring up your slide, gas masses?
Yep. They were the first gas helmets. That is another story. It's not the classical gas mask of the Western Front.
So, other questions while Frank brings this up?
And they were
So I just want to know, the guys on the right-hand side, what is going on there?
that is just posing. You know, you get a new.
Just have fun.
They have fun for the picture because they never use that.
They're clowning around.
Yeah. It was a new thing. They thought it would be funny to send a picture home, and the picture is in the Australian War Memorial. There are just 3 to 5 images. First of all, there were not a lot of gas masks or gas helmets at that time. They were not used, but some of the guys, I assume, just played a little bit with the camera and sent that home. When I searched last night to look for other pictures, there were just 5 to 6. When you enter gas helmets, it's not that much. They sent 10,000, but I'm not sure how many were really given out. Because the British had the problem at that time. Churchill said, I want to use gas, but we can just use it when the Germans used it before.
Yeah.
So that was the British discussion.
No first use.
Yeah, and here the Germans were reluctant, even if they sent the material to the battle scene. So they had to wait until 1916 in Palestine to use gas in the Middle East as well.
Other questions?
They made them for horses as well. Pretty interesting to see that.
If there's nobody popping right up, I'd like to ask Mark.
Yeah,
Mark,
go ahead.
I remember reading about, there was a consideration in the British Indian government, but back in Whitehall, there was a consideration of opening the civil service exams to Indians. And that was, as I remember, that was put down, it was refuted because the statement was made, if we allow the exams to be open to Indians, it'll be predominated by Bengalis, and they will take up all of the positions that would be open.
And they were afraid of Shakespeare walls.
Yeah, that's right.
But basic, competition walls.
Competition.
People who just crammed,
Exactly.
right? So they raised the age of entrance
Yeah,
to a point where no Indian family could ever afford to send their kid to Britain
Yeah.
to learn how to answer the questions of the exam and go to Oxford for
Yeah.
4 years.
Yeah.
Then they could take the exam.
Yeah.
And that automatically meant hardly anyone could take the exam. This is the point, though, this is a resolution of the Indian National Congress every year, to
Exactly.
get rid of these, lower the age of entrance.
Yeah.
And of course, Indians still did it.
Yeah.
Beginning about 1897, 1 or 2 a year would pass the exam.
exactly.
Yeah,
It's
and that
very
was
revealing.
intolerable.
It's
Yes.
very revealing, yeah.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Going once?
Oh, I guess-
Oh, go ahead.
John, I'm just thinking
Yeah.
about your presentation.
Right.
It's so interesting to have an East Asia scholar focus on it. And
Dangerous, maybe.
I know, I really like,
No, I
I'm
enjoy
very
doing it,
intrigued.
yeah.
And so,
Yeah.
you mentioned that a lot of these books have a British perspective.
Yes, right.
Was,
Right.
is there a common thread that runs through them about East Asia, their perceptions of East Asia?
No,
Or they
actually,
mention East
no,
Asia?
the thing is, Macmillan's book is really the only book that addresses East Asia in any detail. She's really good on international stuff and empire stuff.
Okay.
She's the best of all the books on the kind of the very large global contextual framework of World War I.
Even
Slick-
not so much Hastings either?
No,
Okay.
no. And Sleepwalkers is really about the diplomacy. He's a diplomatic historian. It's about the diplomacy of that time period, and so it's, I think that's why it's the best book about them.
I think it's in general a Western problem, I would say. The Cambridge History of the First World War in 3 volumes has one article, the First World War in Asia.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
I was invited to a conference in Moscow last year, and they finally published a book and said I should cover Asia. And I asked them how many pages they would give me, and they said 1,200 words. So, in general, it's a problem
But
of
this-
European historiography.
This, I mean, Bart is here, so ask him questions.
Yeah, I was gonna ask.
He is going to write the work on the World War I in the Pacific. So,
Yeah,
ask away.
I'd like to start out, Barbara, what do you think of Margaret Macmillan's approach and her concept in the book?
Maybe he hasn't read the book.
I've read the Versailles book, but I haven't read the Outbreak of War book, I'm sorry to say.
Then what do you think
But,
of the way, what do you think of the way John has presented
Well-
this? I mean, how does it fit into
Jim,
your?
did you take over chairing the session?
I mean, it is.
I wouldn't dare.
I mean, we're talking about the historiography of the outbreak of war, but there are also, I mean, the perception is, well, one might ask, why is the First World War a global war? And what I come to conclude, at least from a European perspective, and particularly from a German perspective, actually, about the Pacific War, that no one is aware of this global perspective of the war.
Right.
I mean, there is certainly an awareness of the Middle East, especially in Britain and Australia. There is a certain awareness of Africa, especially in Germany, but when it comes to the Pacific, it gets really, really thin. So, and seeing the significance of those events for the future, for future years, it might be surprising. And I will add one thing, because I do talk to Australians a lot, including Australian historians and journalists, and I got feedback from journalists in Australia, the editor-in-chief of the Australian newspaper, for example, that bringing the Pacific into the Australian public mind would actually be a really good idea, because so few people know about it.
Yeah.
So this is actually something from the region.
Actually, I do have a question for you, Bart. Does in 1915, then, after you conclude, the Japanese issue the 21 demands to China, which is essentially their move to try to take over China. I mean, they're gonna have advisors to the government. They're gonna do the whole thing. And of course, the Americans respond very angrily to this. But how do the British respond to this? I mean, maybe I'm putting you on the spot.
Again, yeah, you're putting me on the spot indeed there. This is not a question on,
Maybe-
but Frank is
yeah.
probably the right person to
The
answer the
last time we
question.
met, I talked about Japan and the First World War, and to entertain him, I did another topic this time. So, in general, the British had no option because they needed the Japanese ships in the Mediterranean for the convoys. So the Japanese had discussed that in circles before it became an official policy, even 2 years before they really claimed the 21 demands.
Okay.
And they knew that the British had no choice.
Okay.
What they hoped for was that the Americans had no interest.
Yeah, right,
But
that's where they were mistaken.
Fortunately, they were unlucky with regard to this.
Right.
Otherwise, we would have a larger
Yeah.
Korea in China.
Right, yeah.
Well, I might maybe just add,
Right.
the Admiralty Foreign Office, sort of, well, I'm not sure whether it's a conflict, but the different perceptions. So what the Admiralty was doing all the time, and in a way they did get the upper hand in terms of strategic planning within the British government, was always very much focused on Europe and about on home waters defense. So this probably fits into what Frank just said, that that the whole focus of what the Admiralty was doing is to get as much support into Europe as they could, which meant as the concessions towards Japan were surprising. In fact, this would have, I assume, include the Chinese question, and this is actually a continuous storyline into 1915, 16, 17, where the Japanese support actually does come in, not to the desired amount, but this is a continuous storyline of Admiralty favorable position towards the Japanese and doing them favors and pressing the British government in general towards that position.
I mean, your slide on the number of battleships in the Pacific, I thought was great, because that's where the British, I guess, have decided strategically to place their bet. And that's very interesting. Yes?
It's for Frank. At what point in time was the relationship between Japan and the British in terms of weapons procurement? Because I know that even in the Battle of Tsushima, most of the ships in the Japanese Navy were made in Britain.
Yeah, they were bought. They were not land. So, in general, the first Anglo-Japanese alliance was drafted and signed in 1902, which was needed for the Russo-Japanese War, because in 1895, in the Triple Intervention, the Japanese tried to secure their back before waging war against Russia again. But it was re-signed in 1907 and 1911, I think. And I know that the second and the third agreements were different with regard to the concept. In the first alliance, it was stated that if one of the countries should be attacked or waging a major war against a single second or third power, the other one would be neutral. And they changed that in one of the later agreements, but there was still that agreement if there is a war of non-aggression of one of the two powers, the other ones were demanded for assistance. At the beginning, there was also a speculation about the question if Japan could be asked to send troops to Russia to create a second Eastern Front after the Russian Revolution. So that far the alliance was stretchable. But the Japanese knew that the British would just request ships at that time. And with regard to the battleships in the Russo-Japanese War, they were British made, but Japanese bought.
Right. I was just wondering how much of an influence that had on the 21 points and the British decision to stay out of.
I would say it's an early form of appeasement. So I cannot wage a war against an ally I need, so I look to the other direction and hope that the United States might have sufficient interest to catch out the fight, or how would you say that in English? Kastanien aus dem Feuer gezaubert. Yeah.
Okay.
There must be a saying in English as well.
There's something there, but
I might just
my German is really out of date.
I might just add one thing on the Anglo-Japanese alliance and on the sort of international perspective thereof. My very recent research has actually revealed something very interesting, that since the Japanese, the French and the Russians couldn't succeed in 1914 to extend the alliance into a four-power alliance, so bring everyone in and thereby keep the Japanese in check, they tried to throw everything into it. So what the French, for example, were doing when the Japanese were asking for further concessions or for some sort of formal guarantee towards what they had acquired I mean, this was an informal agreement that I was talking about, but the Japanese were asking for some formal recognition. So the French were actually trying to throw in guarantees from Japan to send more troops, to send troops to the Western Front. The Russians were trying to throw in Japanese concessions for modern artillery to be sent to Russia from Japan. So this they have a really interesting international dimension. This whole two-party agreement, which was sort of very flexible, as Frank also said, because it, yeah, I just wanted to expand on that.
So, and then in 1921-22, in the Washington Accords, then the Anglo-Japanese alliance disappears, and it becomes that broad framework, and that works for a while. Okay, let's stop, and 15-minute break. There's food outside, I hope, and we'll see you back at 3:45. Great session, great, thank you very much.